Miss Marple and the Parish Nativity that ended in silence. Welcome to Cafe Tales. My name is Ailey, and I feel truly grateful to see so many of you return each evening. I'd love to know, why do you enjoy these gentle mysteries so much? Write it below and remember to subscribe for new tales every day. Now, let's step into tonight's mystery together. Chapter 1. Snowfall over St. Oldhelms. The late afternoon light was fading rapidly as the train pulled into the small station at St. Helms, and Miss Jane Marple, gathering her knitting bag and modest traveling case, reflected that there was something particularly peaceful about the approach of Christmas in an English village. The snow had begun to fall in earnest now, soft flakes that settled on the platform and muffled all sound, save for the cheerful whistle of the station master. "Miss Marple! Oh, my dear Jane, how wonderful to see you." Florence Peaton came hurrying along the platform, her cheeks pink with cold and excitement. She was a comfortable-looking woman in her late 50s, wrapped in a sensible woolen coat, and with a scarf that had clearly been knitted by enthusiastic but inexpert hands. "Florence?" "Dear," said Miss Marple, accepting a warm embrace. "How very kind of you to meet me yourself. I hope it hasn't been an inconvenience." "Not at all, not at all. Robert is up to his eyes with the nativity preparations, and I was glad of the excuse to escape for half an hour. The whole village has gone quite mad with excitement." As they made their way to the waiting motor car, driven by a taciturn man whom Mrs. Peaton introduced as Hawkins, the sexton, Miss Marple listened with apparent contentment to her friend's cheerful chatter about parish affairs. Yet even in these first moments, her keen blue eyes were noting certain things. The way Mrs. Peaton's smile grew strained when she mentioned her husband, the vicar. The manner in which her hands worried at the clasp of her handbag. The slight tremor in her voice when she spoke of the play itself. "Of course, we've done the Nativity every Christmas for the past 30 years, Mrs. Peaton was saying as they drove through the snowy lanes toward the village center. "Robert considers it the highlight of the church calendar. The children do so look forward to it." "How delightful," murmured Miss Marple. "And I expect the whole parish turns out for the performance?" "Oh yes, everyone. Standing room only, usually." A pause. "Though this year has been rather... well, there have been one or two difficulties with the arrangements." Miss Marple said nothing, merely continued to gaze out at the passing cottages with their lighted windows. But her silence was of the encouraging sort that invited confidences. "Nothing serious?" "Of course," Mrs. Peaton added quickly, rather too quickly. "Just the usual committee disagreements. You know how these things can be." Miss Marple did indeed know. In her experience, amateur theatrical productions were a breeding ground for jealousy, resentment, and wounded pride. She had seen a similar situation in St. Mary Mead involving the summer pageant, which had culminated in an unfortunate incident with the Maple and Mrs. Price Ridley's best hat. The vicarage was a solid Georgian building that stood adjacent to the church, its windows glowing warmly against the gathering dusk. As they entered the hallway, stamping snow from their feet, Miss Marple heard voices raised in what sounded distinctly like an argument coming from the drawing room. "Oh dear," said Mrs. Peaton faintly. "That will be the committee meeting. It was meant to finish at 4. A door opened abruptly and a tall, angular woman emerged, her expression thunderous. She wore her hat at an aggressive angle and carried herself with the unmistakable authority of one accustomed to having her own way. "I have said my piece, Vicar, and I stand by it. If certain people persist in this course of action, I shall have no choice but to withdraw my support entirely." She swept past Miss Marple and Mrs. Peaton without acknowledgement and disappeared into the snowy evening. "That was Mrs. Langdon, our choir mistress," Mrs. Peaton explained in a whisper. "She's rather particular about things." The Reverend Robert Peaton appeared in the doorway, a worried-looking man with thinning hair and the perpetually anxious expression of one who finds himself, through no fault of his own, at the center of other people's disputes. He brightened somewhat at the sight of his guest. "Miss Marple, welcome, welcome. I do apologize for that rather unfortunate scene. Committee matters, you know. They can become rather heated." "I'm sure," said Miss Marple gently. "It is a great responsibility organizing such an important village event." 2 more people emerged from the drawing room. The first was a stout, red-faced man whom the vicar introduced as Major Hartley, the churchwarden. The second was a younger woman, pale and pretty, with nervous hands that plucked at her gloves. "This is Miss Susan Hewitt," said Mrs. Peaton. "Her daughter Clara is playing the Angel Gabriel this year." "Such an honor for her," Miss Hewitt said, though her smile seemed forced. "Though I confess I'll be glad when it's all over. Clara has been so anxious about remembering her lines." "Natural stage fright," boomed Major Hartley. "Had it myself before my first posting to India. Soon passes." As they dispersed and Miss Marple was shown to her room, she found herself thinking about that curious little scene: the angry choir mistress, the worried vicar, the anxious mother. Behind the festive preparations, there were currents of tension running deep. Later, over tea in the drawing room, Mrs. Peaton became more expansive. The fire crackled pleasantly, and outside, the snow continued to fall, transforming St. Oldhelm's into a picture from a Christmas card. "I'm so glad you're here, Jane," she said suddenly. "I know it's foolish of me, but I've been feeling rather uneasy about the whole affair. The Nativity. Yes, there have been such odd little incidents. Props going missing, then turning up again in the wrong places. Yesterday, someone left all the sheet music scattered about the choir loft. And then today, during rehearsal, one of the star props fell from the rafters. It might have struck little Tommy Benson on the head if he hadn't moved just in time." "An accident, surely," Miss Marple said. Mrs. Peaton set down her teacup with a slight clatter. "That's what we all said. But Hawkins examined the rope afterward. He told me privately that it looked as though it had been cut partway through so that it would give way under weight." Miss Marple's needles continued their rhythmic clicking, but her eyes were thoughtful. "How very disturbing," she said. "One wonders what anyone could have against a children's nativity play. That's just it. It makes no sense at all, unless—" Mrs. Peaton hesitated. "Unless someone wants to stop the performance from taking place. But why should anyone wish that?" "I don't know. But Robert has been so strange lately, preoccupied. He spends hours locked in his study, and I've seen him burning letters in the fireplace. And then there's Mrs. Langdon. She and Robert have been having the most intense conversations in the vestry. When I come upon them, they stop talking at once." Miss Marple said nothing, but she thought of many things. She thought of a case in St. Mary Mead involving a parish treasurer and misappropriated funds. She thought of a scandal that had rocked a neighboring village when it emerged that the organist and the lady of the manor had been conducting an improper correspondence. Human nature, she reflected, was remarkably consistent, whether in matters great or small. "I expect it will all sort itself out," she said comfortingly. "These things usually do." "When is the performance?" "Tomorrow evening, Christmas Eve." "Then we shall see," said Miss Marple, and returned to her knitting. But that night, lying awake in the guest room while the snow whispered against the windows, she found herself unable to sleep. There was something wrong in St. Oldhelm's, something that lurked beneath the carols and the tinsel, and the innocent faces of children rehearsing their lines, had learned long ago to trust these instincts, cultivated over years of observing her fellow creatures in all their infinite variety. Tomorrow would bring answers. Or perhaps, she thought with a slight chill, tomorrow would bring questions far more troubling than any she had yet imagined. Chapter 2. The rehearsal mishap. The morning dawned clear and cold, the snow lying thick upon the churchyard and transforming St. Aldhelm's into something resembling a Flemish painting. Miss Marple, who'd always been an early riser, found herself alone at the breakfast table, her hostess having left a note to say she'd gone ahead to the church to oversee the final preparations. Miss Marple ate her toast and marmalade with deliberation, her mind occupied with the curious facts that had emerged the previous evening: a cut rope, a preoccupied vicar, an angry choir mistress. Separately, these things might mean nothing. Together, they formed a pattern, though as yet Miss Marple could not quite discern its shape. She was interrupted in these reflections by the appearance of Hawkins, the sexton who had come to collect Mrs. Peaton's shopping list. "Begging your pardon, Miss," he said with the awkward courtesy of one unused to addressing ladies of quality, "the mistress said you might wish to walk over to the church this morning. Final rehearsal starts at 10 o'clock. "How kind," said Miss Marple. "I should be delighted. Perhaps you might show me the way, Mr. Hawkins." As they walked through the snowy lanes, Miss Marple engaged the sexton in conversation with the gentle persistence that was her particular gift. She learned that he had served the church for 30 years, that he was a widower, and that he took a dim view of the current state of affairs. "Too many cooks, if you ask me," he said gruffly. "Time was, the vicar would decide what was what, and that would be an end to it. Now there's committees and subcommittees, and everyone with an opinion." "Mrs. Langdon strikes me as a lady with rather decided views," Miss Marple observed mildly. Hawkins snorted. "Mrs. Langdon strikes me as a lady who ought to mind her own business, always in the vestry, always whispering with the vicar. Her husband was the same, God rest him. Thought they owned the church, the pair of them." This was illuminating. Miss Marple stored the information away as they approached the church, a handsome medieval structure with a square tower that rose above the snow-covered yews. Inside, chaos reigned. Children ran up and down the aisles in various states of costume, their excited voices echoing off the ancient stones. Mrs. Peaton stood near the altar looking harassed, while the vicar attempted to restore order with limited success. "Places, everyone. We must have order." His voice, though earnest, lacked the necessary authority. Miss Marple slipped into a pew near the back, settling herself comfortably with her knitting. From this vantage point, she had an excellent view of the entire proceedings. Mrs. Langdon sat at the piano, her back rigidly straight, striking chords with barely suppressed irritation. Near her stood a young woman whom Miss Marple recognized as Susan Hewitt, Clara's mother. She was watching her daughter with an expression of mingled pride and anxiety. Clara herself was a pretty child of about 12, fair-haired and serious-faced. She wore a makeshift pair of wings fashioned from cardboard and white cloth and held her script with trembling hands. "From the beginning," called the vicar. Mary and Joseph approached the stable. "Remember, Tommy, you're weary from the journey." Young Tommy Benson, a sturdy boy of 10, shuffled forward with exaggerated exhaustion, while a small girl in blue robes followed him. The children playing the innkeeper and his wife took their positions. Miss Marple watched with interest, her needles moving steadily. She observed that Major Hartley stood near the vestry door, arms folded, watching the proceedings with the critical eye of one who had once commanded troops. Beside him was a thin, nervous-looking man whom she had not yet met. "That's Mr. Greaves." "The church treasurer," whispered a voice beside her. Miss Marple turned to find an elderly woman had settled into the adjacent pew. "I'm Mrs. Blackwood. You must be Mrs. Peaton's friend from London." "From St. Mary Mead, actually," Miss Marple corrected gently. "How do you do?" Mrs. Blackwood proved to be a valuable source of parish gossip, delivered in an undertone while the rehearsal proceeded. Miss Marple learned that Mr. Greaves had recently lost his position at the local bank, that his wife had left him the previous year, and that he was considered rather too fond of his evening glass of whiskey. Of course, one shouldn't speak ill, Mrs. Blackwood concluded without conviction. But there are those who say the church accounts haven't been properly audited in years. This, too, was interesting. Miss Marple filed it away with the other fragments of information she was collecting. The rehearsal progressed through the familiar scenes. The shepherds received their tidings of great joy. The three kings made their entrance, bearing their symbolic gifts. And then came Clara's moment. Standing on a raised platform to represent the angelic announcement. "Fear not," she began, her young voice clear and sweet. "For behold, I bring you good tidings of great joy." It was at that precise moment that the large wooden star suspended above the altar began to sway. Miss Marple looked up sharply. The star, painted gold and decorated with tinsel, was secured by what appeared to be a system of ropes and pulleys. As she watched, one of the ropes went suddenly slack. "Look out!" cried Hawkins from somewhere near the altar. The star plummeted downward, its trajectory carrying it directly toward the spot where Clara stood. The child, frozen with shock, seemed unable to move. It was Major Hartley who reacted with the speed born of military training. He lunged forward and seized Clara by the arm, pulling her roughly aside. The star crashed onto the platform where she had been standing moments before, splintering the wooden boards and sending up a cloud of dust. For a moment, there was absolute silence. Then Mrs. Hewitt screamed and rushed forward to gather her daughter into her arms. The other children began to cry. Mrs. Peaton stood as though turned to stone, one hand pressed to her mouth. Miss Marple rose from her pew and made her way quietly to where Hawkins was examining the fallen star. The vicar joined them, his face pale. "This is dreadful. Absolutely dreadful. If the Major hadn't been so quick—" "The rope appears to have snapped," Hawkins said slowly. He held up one end for inspection, though it was new rope. "I put it up myself last week." Miss Marple bent closer, her sharp eyes examining the frayed end. She said nothing, but she noticed what others might have missed. The fibers were not evenly torn, as they would be from natural wear. Instead, they showed the clean marks of a blade that had cut partway through, weakening the rope so that it would break under the star's weight. "Perhaps we should postpone the performance," Mrs. Peaton said faintly, "till we can be certain everything is safe." "Nonsense," said Mrs. Langdon crisply, rising from the piano bench. "It was an accident, nothing more. Old rope, probably. We can't disappoint the entire village over one mishap." "The rope was new," Hawkins repeated stubbornly. "Then it was faulty," Mrs. Langdon snapped. "Really, Vicar? If we're to cancel every time something goes wrong, we shall never do anything at all." Miss Marple watched this exchange with great interest. She noted that Mrs. Langdon's hands, clasped before her, were trembling slightly despite her confident words. She noted, too, that Mr. Greaves had slipped away during the confusion, and that the vicar would not meet his wife's eyes. "I think," said Miss Marple quietly to Mrs. Peaton, as the rehearsal resumed with forced cheerfulness, "that someone is very determined indeed that this play should not take place. The question is why?" Chapter 3. A Star That Wouldn't Shine. The afternoon of Christmas Eve brought with it a curious stillness to St. Oldhelms, as though the village itself were holding its breath. Miss Marple, who had spent the hours since the morning's alarming incident in quiet contemplation and conversation with various parishioners, found herself increasingly troubled by what she had observed. She had taken tea with Mrs. Blackwood, who'd been only too happy to elaborate on the history of parish tensions. She had encountered Mr. Greaves coming out of the public house, his breath betraying the source of his afternoon comfort. And she had seen through the vicarage study window the Reverend Peaton bent over his desk with his head in his hands, the very picture of a man in despair. Now, as the church bells chimed 6 and the first villagers began to arrive for the performance, Miss Marple made her way through the snowy churchyard with Mrs. Peaton at her side. "I do hope it will go well," her friend said anxiously. "After this morning's dreadful business, I've been quite beside myself. Robert barely touched his lunch, and he's been locked in his study all afternoon." "I expect he has much on his mind," Miss Marple said gently. "The responsibility of the parish must weigh heavily at times." They entered the church, where the transformation from morning chaos to evening splendor was remarkable. Candles flickered in the windows, casting dancing shadows on the ancient walls. The scent of pine and beeswax filled the air. The manger scene had been arranged near the altar, complete with straw and a wooden cradle. Above it, a new star had been suspended, this one electric rather than wooden, its cord securely fastened. The pews were filling rapidly with villagers wrapped in their winter coats, their faces bright with anticipation. Miss Marple took her seat in the third row, her knitting bag beside her, and watched the gathering with her usual quiet attention. Major Hartley bustled about, checking that the side doors were properly secured. Mrs. Langdon sat at the piano, sorting through sheets of music with sharp, decisive movements. Mr. Greaves stood near the vestry, shifting his weight from foot to foot and glancing repeatedly at his pocket watch. Behind the heavy velvet curtain that had been erected to screen the staging area, Miss Marple could hear the excited whispers of the children and the lower voices of the adults attempting to maintain order. She caught a glimpse of Clara's fair hair as the child peeped through a gap in the curtain, her angel's wings visible in the candlelight. The vicar emerged from the vestry at 6:15, looking pale but composed. He mounted the steps to the altar and raised his hands for silence. "My dear friends," he began, his voice carrying through the hushed church, "what a joy it is to see you all gathered here on this most blessed of evenings. For generations, our village has come together to witness the retelling of the greatest story ever told, and tonight, we continue that sacred tradition." He paused, and Miss Marple thought she detected a tremor in his voice. "Let us pray that we may all receive the message of peace and goodwill that this season brings, and that we may carry it forward into the new year with humble and contrite hearts." There was something odd about that prayer, Miss Marple reflected. The emphasis on humble and contrite hearts seemed pointed, almost personal. She glanced at Mrs. Langdon and saw that the woman's jaw had tightened, her fingers pressing hard against the piano keys without making a sound. The vicar descended, and the lights were dimmed. Mrs. Langdon began to play a gentle carol, and the curtain drew back to reveal the stable scene. A collective murmur of appreciation rose from the audience. The play proceeded smoothly at first. Little Tommy Benson and his Mary made their way from pew to pew seeking shelter. The innkeeper, played by a stout boy of 8, delivered his lines with more enthusiasm than accuracy. The audience chuckled appreciatively as the Holy Family settled into their stable. Miss Marple's attention, however, was not entirely on the performance. She was watching the adults. Mrs. Hewitt sat at the end of a pew near the front, her hands clasped so tightly that her knuckles showed white. Hawkins stood at the back, his weathered face impassive, but his eyes alert. And there, slipping in through the side door just as the shepherds made their entrance, was a man she had not seen before. He was perhaps 50, dressed in a dark overcoat and carrying himself with a certain authority. "He said he was from the diocese," Mrs. Blackwood whispered beside Miss Marple, having noticed her attention. "Come to observe the proceedings, though I don't recall the vicar mentioning any official inspection." Miss Marple filed this information away with interest. A stranger in the village arriving on the very evening of the performance. It might mean nothing, then again, it might mean everything. The shepherds received their angelic message, delivered by 3 small girls whose wings shed feathers with each movement. The 3 kings processed down the aisle with stately dignity, bearing their gifts of cardboard boxes wrapped in gold paper. And then came Clara's moment. She stepped onto the platform, which had been reinforced since the morning's accident. Her wings spread wide and a tinsel halo perched on her fair hair. The electric star above the altar was meant to illuminate at this moment, casting her in a shaft of golden light. Clara opened her mouth to speak her lines. "Fear not, for behold." At that instant, the electric star flickered, once, twice, and then went out entirely, plunging the altar area into relative darkness. There was a confused murmur from the audience. Mrs. Langdon continued to play, though her tempo had become uncertain. The vicar half rose from his seat in the front pew. Then from behind the curtain came a sound that made Miss Marple's blood run cold. It was a faint cry, quickly stifled, followed by the unmistakable thud of something falling. The audience, uncertain whether this was part of the performance, waited in uneasy silence. Miss Marple saw the vicar's face in the candlelight, and what she saw there confirmed her worst fears. This was no planned dramatic effect. Major Hartley moved quickly toward the curtain. Hawkins was already there, pulling it aside. In the dimness beyond, Miss Marple could make out the shapes of the other children, frozen in confusion. And there, crumpled at the base of the platform, lay Clara. Her angel's wings askew and her eyes closed. Mrs. Hewitt screamed. The sound echoed through the ancient church like a physical blow. She rushed forward, pushing past the major, and gathered her daughter into her arms. "Clara! Clara, speak to me!" The child did not respond. Her face, so animated moments before, was slack and pale. Her breathing came in shallow gasps. "Someone fetch Dr. Morrison," the vicar said, his voice strained. "Quickly now!" The stranger from the diocese moved forward, his professional manner now explained. "I'm a physician," he said quietly. "Let me examine the child." But even as he knelt beside Clara, Miss Marple saw Mrs. Peaton clutch at her husband's arm, her face ashen. She heard the vicar whisper something to Major. Hartley saw the Major's face harden with shock. The audience was being ushered out now. Hawkins and several other men shepherding the confused villagers toward the doors. The children backstage had begun to cry. Miss Marple remained in her pew, her hands still folded over her knitting. She watched the physician examine Clara with swift efficiency. She saw him smell the child's breath, frown, and look up at the vicar with an expression that conveyed everything without words. "We must get her to hospital immediately," he said. "But I fear—" He did not finish the sentence. Miss Marple rose slowly and made her way to where Mrs. Peaton stood trembling. "Florence, dear," she said softly, "I think you should tell me exactly what has been going on in this parish, because unless I am very much mistaken, what we have witnessed tonight is not an accident at all. Someone has poisoned that child." The words hung in the cold air like an accusation. Mrs. Peaton's eyes filled with tears, and she nodded mutely. The curtain, meant to rise again for the final scene, remained closed. The nativity play had ended, not in celebration, but in a terrible, echoing silence. Chapter 4. The Angel with the Broken Halo. Miss Marple had seen death before in its many guises, and she had learned to recognize its particular stillness. As she sat by the fire in the vicarage drawing room the following morning, her knitting needles moving with mechanical precision, she reflected that Clara Hewitt had come very close indeed to that ultimate silence. The child lived, but barely. Dr. Morrison, summoned from his Christmas Eve dinner, had confirmed what the visiting physician had suspected: poison. The word itself seemed obscene in the context of a children's nativity play. Yet there it was, undeniable and terrible. Mrs. Peaton sat opposite Miss Marple, her eyes red from weeping, her hands restless in her lap. The vicar had not emerged from his study since returning from the hospital in the early hours of the morning. "They say she may not speak again," Mrs. Peaton whispered. The shock to her system was so severe. Dr. Morrison called it sudden shock when the constable asked, but he told me privately." She broke off, unable to continue. "He told you it was poison?" Miss Marple said gently. It was not a question. Mrs. Peaton nodded miserably. "He recognized the signs at once. Said he'd seen something similar during the war. Soldiers who'd been exposed to certain substances. He's reported it to the police, of course. They arrived this morning from the county office trying to be discreet." "Very wise," murmured Miss Marple. "A scandal of this nature would be most damaging to the village." She set down her knitting and looked thoughtfully into the fire. Outside, Christmas morning had dawned cold and bright, the snow sparkling under a pale sun. Elsewhere in England, families would be gathering for their festive celebrations. In St. Aldhelm's, the church bells had not rung, and the vicarage was shrouded in an atmosphere of dread. "Tell me," Miss Marple said, "what exactly did the doctor say about the nature of the poison?" Mrs. Peaton dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. "He wasn't entirely certain, but he suspected something from the cyanide family. He said there was a particular smell on the child's breath, like bitter almonds, though not everyone can detect it." "He can, apparently, and so could that other doctor, the one who happened to be there." "How very fortunate that he was," Miss Marple observed. "One might almost say providential. Dr. Lawrence's name is. He's attached to the diocese offices, apparently, traveling about to inspect the medical facilities at various parishes. Pure chance that he should have been at our performance." Miss Marple said nothing, but she thought a great deal. In her experience, pure chance was rarely as pure as it appeared. She made a mental note to inquire further about Dr. Lawrence and his convenient presence. "The constable has been questioning everyone who was backstage," Mrs. Peaton continued. "All the cast members, the helpers, anyone who might have had access to Clara before she collapsed." "And the refreshments," Miss Marple prompted. "I assume there were refreshments prepared for the cast?" "Oh yes, laid out in the vestry. Mrs. Langdon organized it all, tea and lemonade for the children and some biscuits. They were to have it during the interval, after the shepherd scene." "But Clara collapsed before the interval." "Yes, though." Mrs. Peaton frowned, trying to remember. "I did see her drinking something earlier, when the children first arrived to prepare. She said she was thirsty from excitement." Miss Marple's needles resumed their clicking. "And who else was in the vestry at that time?" "Several people, I should think. Mrs. Langdon certainly, arranging everything. Hawkins was in and out checking the heating. Major Hartley was helping to organize the costumes, and Mr. Greaves was there briefly, I believe, though I can't think why." "Perhaps," said Miss Marple delicately, "he had business in the vestry." "The poor offering boxes are kept there," Mrs. Peaton admitted reluctantly. "Robert always counts the collection after evening services. But surely you're not suggesting Mr. Greaves would harm a child?" "I am suggesting nothing," Miss Marple replied. "I am merely gathering facts, as one gathers wool for knitting. The pattern emerges only when one has sufficient thread to work with." A knock at the door interrupted them. Hawkins entered, looking even more grim than usual. "Begging your pardon, ma'am, but the police inspector wishes to speak with the vicar." "I told him the vicar wasn't receiving, but he insists." "Show him to the study," Mrs. Peaton said wearily. "Robert will have to see him eventually." When Hawkins had withdrawn, she turned to Miss Marple with desperation in her eyes. "Jane, I know it's dreadful of me to ask, but you've dealt with this sort of thing before. In St. Mary Mead there were those cases." "Those were rather different circumstances," Miss Marple demurred, though she knew perfectly well what her friend was asking. "But you understood what was happening when no one else did. You saw the truth behind the appearances." Mrs. Peaton leaned forward urgently. "There's something terrible in this parish, something I don't fully understand. Robert won't speak to me about it, but I know he's deeply troubled. And now this dreadful thing has happened to an innocent child." Miss Marple was silent for a moment, considering. Then she said quietly, Tell me about Mrs. Langdon. The abrupt change of subject seemed to startle Mrs. Peaton. Edith? What about her? You mentioned yesterday that she and your husband have been having intense conversations, that they stopped speaking when you entered the room. A flush crept up Mrs. Peaton's neck. I don't wish to cast aspersions. Edith has been a pillar of this church since her husband died 5 years ago. She and Robert have always worked closely together on parish matters, but something has changed recently. It was not a question, Miss Marple pressed gently. Mrs. Peaton did not treat it as one. She looked down at her hands, twisting the handkerchief between her fingers. Clara's mother, Susan Hewitt, came to me 3 days ago. She was very agitated. She said Clara had seen something at the church, something that worried her. She wouldn't tell her mother what it was, only that she thought it was wrong, and that she meant to speak to the vicar about it after the performance. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. After the performance? Yes. She wanted to wait until Christmas was over, she said. Didn't want to spoil things for the other children. How very considerate of her, Miss Marple murmured. And did she speak to anyone else about what she had seen? I don't know. Susan was quite distressed about it. She asked me if I thought Clara was imagining things, being fanciful. I assured her that children often misunderstand adult conversations and situations. But you're no longer certain that Clara misunderstood, are you? Mrs. Peaton met Miss Marple's steady gaze and shook her head slowly. No. I think Clara saw something real, something that someone desperately wanted to keep hidden. And I think... Her voice dropped to barely a whisper. I think someone tried to silence her before she could speak. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Poison at Christmas, she said softly. Rather more sinister than tinsel, as I observed myself last night. The question now is, what did Clara see, and who was so afraid of her speaking that they were willing to commit such a monstrous act? She picked up her knitting once more, her fingers moving with practiced ease, while her mind worked over the pieces of the puzzle that was slowly coming together. Chapter 5. A Stranger Among the Shepherds. By afternoon, Miss Marple determined that remaining in the vicarage, however comfortable, would not advance her understanding of the situation. Mrs. Peaton had retreated to her room with a headache, and the vicar remained closeted with the police inspector. Miss Marple, therefore, put on her warmest coat and sensible boots and set out for the village. The main street of St. Oldhelms was quiet. The shops closed for Christmas, but the public house was open, and it was there that Miss Marple directed her steps. She had learned long ago that village opinion could be most reliably sampled in such establishments, particularly when tragedy had struck. She found Mrs. Blackwood installed by the fire with several other ladies of the parish, their voices low but animated. They fell silent as Miss Marple entered. Then, recognizing her as Mrs. Peaton's guest, they made room for her to join them. Terrible business, said Mrs. Blackwood. Once the proprieties had been observed and Miss Marple had been supplied with a small sherry. That poor child. They say she may never recover properly. The doctors are hopeful, Miss Marple said carefully, though she knew this to be an optimistic interpretation of the facts. It's the parents I feel sorry for, offered another woman, whom Miss Marple recognized as the wife of the greengrocer. Susan Hewitt is beside herself, won't leave the child's bedside. And the father? Miss Marple inquired gently. There was a brief, awkward silence. Mrs. Blackwood leaned forward conspiratorially. There is no Mr. Hewitt, not anymore. He left when Clara was just a baby. Went off to Australia, they say, and never sent a penny back. Susan's had to raise the girl alone, working as a seamstress. Very respectable, mind you. But it has been hard for them. This cast Clara's mother in a somewhat different light. A woman struggling alone. Her daughter the center of her world. And now that daughter lying unconscious in hospital. Poisoned by person or persons unknown. I understand there was a stranger at the church last evening, A doctor from the diocese? Dr. Lawrence? Yes, the greengrocer's wife nodded vigorously. Said he was doing inspections of parish facilities. Lucky he was there, really, given what happened. Though some might say it was odd timing, Mrs. Blackwood observed darkly. Arriving just on that very evening and no one in the parish having been told to expect him. Perhaps the vicar knew, Miss Marple suggested. If he did, he never mentioned it to Florence, Mrs. Blackwood said. And you'd think he would have, wouldn't you? A diocesan inspection is hardly the sort of thing one keeps quiet about. Miss Marple agreed that it was indeed curious. She sipped her sherry and listened as the conversation turned to speculation about who might have wished Clara harm. The theories ranged from the absurd to the merely improbable, but one theme emerged consistently. No one could imagine why anyone would target a child. Unless, Mrs. Blackwood said slowly, it wasn't meant for her at all. What if someone else was supposed to drink from that cup? This possibility had already occurred to Miss Marple, but she was interested to hear it voiced by someone else. The question then becomes, she said mildly, who was the intended victim and why did Clara drink instead? No one had an answer to that. Miss Marple left the public house shortly thereafter and made her way to the church. The building was locked, but she found Hawkins in the churchyard, clearing snow from the pathways with methodical determination. "Good afternoon, Mr. Hawkins," she said. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all, miss." He leaned on his shovel, his breath misting in the cold air. "Sad day for St. Oldhelm's." "Indeed. I wonder if I might ask you something about last evening. I understand you were helping to prepare the vestry before the performance." "That's right, miss." "Checking the heating, making sure everything was ready for the little ones?" "And you saw the refreshments that had been laid out?" "Couldn't miss them. Mrs. Langdon had arranged it all very particular, cups in rows, everything just so." "She's very particular, Mrs. Langdon." "Were the cups all the same?" Hawkins frowned, considering. "Now you mention it, no. Most were the usual church cups, the plain white ones we use for tea after services. But there was one different cup, fancier like, had a pattern on it. Blue flowers or some such." Miss Marple's pulse quickened slightly, though her expression remained placid. How interesting. "And do you know who that cup was intended for?" "Can't say for certain, miss, but I remember Mrs. Langdon telling young Clara to use that one particular. Said it was special, on account of her being the angel Gabriel. This was significant indeed." Miss Marple filed it away carefully. "And the stranger who was there last evening, Dr. Lawrence, did you notice him during the preparations?" "Can't say I knew he was a doctor then, miss. Just thought he was another visitor. But yes, I saw him. He spent considerable time near the vestry. Said he was admiring the architecture. Asked a good many questions about the building's history." "Did he go into the vestry?" Hawkins scratched his chin thoughtfully. "You know, miss, I believe he did. Said he wanted to see the memorial plaques on the wall. I was busy with the heating boiler, so I didn't pay much attention." "Quite understandable," Miss Marple assured him. "And after the performance began, where were you positioned?" "At the back of the church, miss, as always, watching to make sure nothing went wrong with the staging." "But something did go wrong. With the star." Hawkins's face darkened. "That wasn't my doing, miss, whatever anyone might think. I checked every rope, every pulley. The electrical connection was sound when I tested it that afternoon." "I'm quite certain you did everything properly," Miss Marple said soothingly, "which suggests that someone tampered with it after your inspection. Tell me, was the church left unattended at any point?" "Only for about an hour, round about 4. I had to go fetch more candles from the shop, as Mrs. Langdon said we didn't have enough. The church was locked, mind, but anyone with a key could have got in." "And who has keys to the church?" "The vicar, naturally. Mrs. Langdon has one, as she's often here early to practice the organ. Major Hartley as church warden and Mr. Greaves, though he's not supposed to use his except for official business. 4 people with access, then 5, if one counted Hawkins himself, though Miss Marple's instinct told her the sexton was not involved. He was too straightforward, too genuinely troubled by what had happened. She thanked Hawkins and made her way back toward the vicarage, her mind turning over these new pieces of information. Special cup marked out for Clara specifically, a stranger with convenient access to the vestry, an electrical star that failed at precisely the crucial moment, and throughout it all, the shadowy figure of Mrs. Langdon, organizing, arranging, being very particular about everything. As she turned into the vicarage drive, she saw a motor car pulling away. Through its window, she caught a glimpse of Dr. Lawrence, his face set in serious lines, so he had been calling on the vicar. How very interesting Mrs. Peaton met her at the door, looking distraught. Oh, Jane, the most dreadful thing. The police have been searching the church, and they found something. A cup hidden behind some hymn books in the vestry, and Hawkins says it has a peculiar smell to it, like bitter almonds. The cup with the blue flowers? Miss Marple asked. Mrs. Peaton stared at her. How did you know? Because, Miss Marple said quietly, removing her coat, it was the cup that someone very deliberately ensured Clara would use. The question we must now answer is whether the poison was meant for her specifically, or whether she drank from a cup intended for someone else entirely. And I begin to think, my dear Florence, that the answer to that question will reveal a great deal more than simply who administered the poison. Chapter 6. The Gift That Went Missing. The day after Christmas dawned gray and cheerless. Miss Marple, who had spent a restless night turning the facts of the case over in her mind, came down to breakfast to find Mrs. Peaton already at the table. Her face pale and drawn. I've hardly slept, she confessed. Every time I close my eyes, I see that poor child collapsing, and Robert is beside himself. He's talking of resigning his living. That would be most unfortunate, Miss Marple observed, helping herself to toast, particularly as it would leave so many questions unanswered. Mrs. Peaton looked up sharply. What do you mean? Simply that running away from a problem rarely solves it. The truth has a way of following one wherever one goes. There was a moment's silence, broken only by the ticking of the mantel clock. Then Mrs. Peaton said in a low voice, Jane, there's something I haven't told you. Something I should have mentioned before, but I was too ashamed. Miss Marple set down her teacup with care. I think you had better tell me now. Mrs. Peaton's hands twisted in her lap. The church's silver chalice has gone missing, the one we use for communion. It's been in the parish for 200 years, a gift from the Langdon family. I discovered it was gone the night before the performance when I went to prepare the altar, and you told no one. I couldn't bear to, not with Christmas coming, not with the Nativity about to take place. I thought perhaps I'd misplaced it, or that Robert had moved it for safekeeping. I kept meaning to search properly, but there was so much to do, and then... She broke off, her voice catching. Then everything happened with Clara, and the chalice seemed so unimportant by comparison. Miss Marple considered this carefully. A valuable silver chalice, missing on the very eve of the performance. It might be coincidence, but she had long ago learned to distrust coincidences. Have you mentioned this to the police? Not yet. I know I should. But Jane, what if it means Robert is somehow involved? What if he took it himself for some reason I can't fathom? Do you believe your husband capable of theft? Mrs. Peaton's eyes filled with tears. I don't know what to believe anymore. He's been so strange these past weeks and so secretive. And those conversations with Mrs. Langdon, always whispering, always stopping when I come near. What if they've been planning something together? Miss Marple rose from the table and moved to sit beside her friend, taking her hand in a gentle clasp. "Florence, I think it's time you told me everything you know or suspect about Mrs. Langdon's relationship with your husband." The story that emerged was fragmentary, but troubling. Over the past 3 months, the vicar and the choir mistress had been meeting regularly in the vestry, sometimes late at night when they thought the church was empty. Mrs. Peaton had seen lights burning and had once overheard raised voices, though she could not make out the words. There had been papers spread on the vestry table, documents that were hastily gathered up when she approached. I thought at first it might be parish business, planning for the Christmas services. But when I asked Robert about it, he became quite sharp with me, said I was imagining things, that Mrs. Langdon was simply helping him with the accounts. The accounts, Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully. That would be Mr. Greaves's responsibility, surely, as church treasurer. Exactly what I thought. But Robert insisted that Edith, Mrs. Langdon, had a better head for figures than poor Mr. Greaves, said he'd asked for her assistance because the books had gotten into rather a muddle. This put an entirely new complexion on matters. Miss Marple recalled Mrs. Blackwood's dark hints about the church accounts not having been properly audited, and Mr. Greaves's unfortunate fondness for drink. "I think," she said slowly, "that I should very much like to speak with Clara's mother." "Is she still at the hospital?" "She is." "She hasn't left Clara's side." "But Jane, what has Susan Hewitt to do with the chalice?" "Perhaps nothing. Perhaps everything. You mentioned that Clara had been worried about something she'd seen, something she'd planned to tell the vicar about after the performance. I wonder if Mrs. Hewitt might know more than she initially revealed." An hour later, Miss Marple found herself at the county hospital, a grim Victorian building that smelled of carbolic and boiled vegetables. Mrs. Hewitt sat beside her daughter's bed, her face haggard with exhaustion and grief. Clara lay motionless, her breathing shallow, her fair hair spread across the pillow. She looked smaller somehow, diminished, as though the poison had drained not just her strength, but her very substance. "Mrs. Hewitt," Miss Marple said gently, "I'm so very sorry to intrude at such a time." "I'm Miss Marple, a friend of Mrs. Peaton's." Susan Hewitt looked up with dull eyes. "You're the lady from St. Mary Mead. Florence mentioned you were visiting. I wonder if I might ask you a few questions about Clara. I know this is difficult, but it may help us understand what happened to her." Mrs. Hewitt nodded slowly. "The police have already questioned me. I've told them everything I know. You mentioned to Mrs. Peaton that Clara had seen something at the church, something that troubled her. Can you tell me any more about that?" She wouldn't say exactly what it was. "You know how children can be, half telling you things, then clamming up when you press them." Mrs. Hewitt's voice broke. "I should have pressed harder. I should have made her tell me." "You mustn't blame yourself," Miss Marple said firmly. "Children are often reluctant to betray adult confidences, even when they sense something is wrong." "Did Clara give you any hint at all about what she'd witnessed?" Mrs. Hewitt was silent for a long moment, staring at her daughter's pale face. Then she said quietly, "She asked me if it was stealing if someone took money that was meant for poor people and used it for themselves." I thought she was talking about a story from school, something hypothetical. But now you think she saw something specific, the Christmas charity fund? The church collects money every Advent to distribute to needy families in the parish. Clara helped to count the donations after services. She was so proud to be given that responsibility. Mrs. Hewitt's hands clenched into fists. What if she saw someone taking from that fund? What if that's why someone tried to kill her? Miss Marple had been thinking along similar lines, but hearing it stated so boldly was nonetheless shocking. Did Clara mention any names? Anyone she saw handling the money? She said. Mrs. Hewitt paused, her brow furrowed in concentration. She said she'd seen a letter, folded up small, being passed between two people after the Sunday service. She said it had numbers written on it, amounts of money. She thought it looked like the kind of accounting her teacher did when collecting dinner money at school. A letter with figures on it, Miss Marple murmured, hidden in a folded note, passed secretly. That would suggest correspondence of a private nature, wouldn't it? Something that couldn't be conducted openly, she also said. Mrs. Hewitt hesitated. She said one of the people looked frightened and the other looked angry. Those were her exact words, frightened and angry. Miss Marple thought of the vicar's preoccupied air, his locked study, his burned letters. She thought of Mrs. Langdon's tight jaw and trembling hands, her insistence that the performance must go on despite the morning's accident, frightened and angry. Yes, that description fits rather well. Thank you, Mrs. Hewitt, you've been most helpful. As Miss Marple rose to leave, Mrs. Hewitt caught her sleeve. Find who did this to my daughter, please. She's all I have in the world. I shall do my very best, Miss Marple promised. Walking back through the hospital corridors, Miss Marple reflected that the pieces of the puzzle were beginning to form a clearer picture. A missing chalice, misappropriated charity funds, secret meetings, and burned letters, and a child who had seen too much and threatened, however innocently, to expose the truth. The question now was whether Clara had been poisoned to prevent her from speaking, or whether she had accidentally drunk from a cup meant for someone else entirely. And if the latter, then who was the intended victim? Chapter 7. Voices Behind the Curtain. Miss Marple had always been a firm believer in the value of nocturnal observation. There was something about the small hours of the night that loosened tongues and revealed truths that daylight kept hidden. It was for this reason that she found herself at 11 that evening, wrapped in her warmest coat and making her way through the snowy churchyard toward St. Aldhelm's. The moon was bright, casting long shadows across the gravestones. The church itself loomed dark against the sky, but as Miss Marple approached, she noticed what she'd hoped to see, a faint glimmer of light from one of the vestry windows. She moved closer, keeping to the shadows of the yew trees. Her feet made barely a whisper in the snow. Years of quiet observation in St. Mary Mead had taught her how to move without drawing attention, a skill that had proved useful on more than one occasion. The vestry window was partially open despite the cold. Through it, Miss Marple could hear voices, low and urgent. "You cannot simply leave," it was the vicar speaking, his tone strained. "That will only make matters worse. The police will want to question you further." "Then let them question me elsewhere." Mrs. Langdon's voice was sharp with barely controlled emotion. "I cannot remain in this village, Robert, not after what has happened. Not with everyone whispering, wondering. Edith, please, we must think rationally about this." "Rationally?" There was a bitter laugh. "When has any of this been rational? We should never have begun it. I told you from the start that it would end badly. We had no choice. The accounts were in chaos. The money was gone, and if anyone had discovered the full extent of it, but someone did discover it. That child discovered it. And now look what's happened." There was a pause. Miss Marple pressed closer to the window, her heart beating rather faster than usual. "You cannot think that I had anything to do with that." The vicar's voice was horrified. "Edith, surely you don't believe I would harm a child?" "I don't know what to believe anymore. All I know is that Clara Hewitt saw something she shouldn't have seen, and now she lies in hospital poisoned. The police will draw their own conclusions. Then we must tell them the truth, all of it. The missing funds, Greaves's embezzlement, everything we've been trying to keep quiet. And destroy your career? Destroy both our reputations? The scandal would be unbearable. Better scandal than to let suspicion of attempted murder fall on either of us." Mrs. Langdon's reply was too quiet for Miss Marple to hear clearly, but the tone was pleading. There was the sound of movement, footsteps pacing back and forth. "I'm leaving tomorrow," Mrs. Langdon said finally, her voice clearer now. "I shall tell people it's for my health. No one will question it, not after the shock of Christmas Eve, and you must do what you think best about the accounts. But Robert, I beg you, be careful how you proceed. There are forces at work here that neither of us fully understands." "What do you mean?" "That stranger, Dr. Lawrence. Did you not think it odd that he appeared precisely when he did? And those questions he asked afterward, about the parish finances, about who had access to the vestry." "He wasn't there by chance, Robert. Someone sent him." "The diocese. Surely they must have had reports of irregularities? Or perhaps someone else has been making inquiries, someone who knew exactly what we would find when we examined the books properly." Miss Marple's mind was working rapidly. So the vicar and Mrs. Langdon had discovered embezzlement, presumably by Mr. Greaves. They had been trying to handle it quietly to avoid scandal. But Clara had somehow witnessed their secret discussions, had seen the evidence of missing funds, and had planned to speak out. But there was still the question of who had poisoned the child, and Mrs. Langdon's mention of scratches caught Miss Marple's attention. She leaned forward slightly, trying to see through the window. "Your hand," the vicar was saying. "Those scratches, how did you get them?" "It's nothing. I caught it on the lock of the poor box when I was checking the Christmas collections. The mechanism is quite stiff. Let me see." There was another pause. "Edith, these look as though you've been forcing something open. Don't be absurd. I told you what happened." "The chalice," the vicar said slowly. "You know where it is, don't you?" "I know nothing of the sort." "Edith, please, if you've taken it, if you've been trying to cover up the losses by selling church property, you must tell me now. I can help you, but only if you're honest with me." "How dare you?" Mrs. Langdon's voice was icy. "After everything I have done to help you, to save this parish from disgrace, you accuse me of theft." "I'm not accusing. I'm asking." "Then I shall answer, no, I did not take the chalice. But I have my suspicions about who did. The same person who has been steadily draining the parish funds for the past 2 years. The same person who has been falsifying the account books and covering his tracks with increasingly desperate measures. Greaves. Who else? He's been drinking away his sorrows and his salary both. When the audit comes, as it inevitably must, he'll be exposed. And I suspect he knows it." Miss Marple absorbed this information with interest. So Mr. Greaves was the embezzler, and the vicar and Mrs. Langdon had been attempting to document the theft before bringing it to the authorities. But where did the poisoning fit into this pattern? The voices inside had dropped to murmurs now, too low for Miss Marple to distinguish words. She was about to move away when she heard footsteps approaching from behind. She turned to find Hawkins standing there, a lantern in his hand, his face grave. "Thought I saw someone moving about the churchyard," he said quietly. "Didn't expect it to be you, Miss Marple." "I couldn't sleep," Miss Marple said truthfully. "I thought a walk might help clear my head." Hawkins glanced toward the lighted vestry window. "They've been in there near an hour now. Heard them myself when I came to check the boiler." "Did you hear what they were discussing?" "Enough to know that there's trouble brewing. Always knew Greaves was light-fingered, if you want the truth. Seen him leaving the church late at night more than once, looking furtive. But I'm just the sexton. Nobody asked my opinion about such things." "Perhaps they should," Miss Marple observed. "In my experience, those who maintain a place often know its secrets better than those who merely use it." The light in the vestry went out suddenly. A moment later, the side door of the church opened, and Mrs. Langdon emerged, followed by the vicar. They both stopped short at the sight of Miss Marple and Hawkins. "Good evening," Miss Marple said pleasantly. "Such a clear night despite the cold. I find I cannot resist a walk when the moon is so bright." Mrs. Langdon's face was pale, her eyes suspicious. Miss Marple noticed the scratches on her right hand, clearly visible even in the moonlight. They were deep, recent, and exactly the sort of marks that might be made by forcing open a locked box or prying at a stubborn lock. "You should not be out alone at such an hour," the vicar said, his voice strained. "It isn't safe." "Oh, I'm quite accustomed to nocturnal rambles," Miss Marple assured him. "And Mr. Hawkins has been kind enough to escort me back to the vicarage." She said her goodnights and walked away with Hawkins, leaving the vicar and Mrs. Langdon standing in awkward silence. Chapter 8. The Quiet in the Nave. The following morning brought heavy snowfall, the kind that muffled all sound, and transformed St. Aldhelms into a hushed white world. Miss Marple stood at the vicarage window, watching the flakes drift down over the churchyard, and reflected that nature had provided a fitting backdrop for the silence that had settled over the parish. Mrs. Petton had taken to her bed with what she called nervous exhaustion. The vicar had left early for the hospital, ostensibly to visit Clara, but Miss Marple suspected also to avoid the awkward questions that hung in the air like the snow itself. Miss Marple was therefore alone when Constable Rix arrived at the vicarage door, stamping snow from his boots, and looking considerably more serious than befitted. A young officer in his first major case. "Begging your pardon, Miss Marple, but I was hoping to speak with the vicar. Important news from the church. I'm afraid Reverend Peaton is at the hospital. Perhaps I might take a message." The constable hesitated, clearly uncertain about confiding in an elderly visitor. But Miss Marple had a way about her that invited confidence, and within moments she had ushered him into the drawing room and supplied him with tea. "It's about the missing chalice," he said, warming his hands on the cup. "We found it." Miss Marple's needles paused in their rhythm. "How very interesting. Where was it discovered?" "In the church, miss, buried beneath the straw in the nativity manger. One of the children found it this morning when they were sent to tidy up the display. The inspector has it now, examining it for fingerprints and such." "And was there anything else with the chalice?" The constable looked startled. "How did you know?" "An educated guess, nothing more. Objects are rarely hidden without some accompanying explanation. There was a note, miss, pinned underneath the chalice with a tack. Said something peculiar." He pulled out his notebook and read carefully. "Forgive us. The truth will not stay buried." Miss Marple considered this. Someone had hidden the chalice deliberately, with a message that suggested both guilt and defiance. It was the act of someone who wished to confess, but lacked the courage to do so openly. "Forgive us?" she repeated softly. "The plural is significant, don't you think? Not forgive me, but forgive us." The inspector noted that as well, miss. "Suggests more than one person is involved." "Indeed it does. Tell me, Constable, has anyone left the village since Christmas Eve?" Mrs. Langdon departed on the morning train. Said she was going to stay with her sister in Bath for her health. The inspector spoke with her before she left, but she had an answer for everything. Said she knew nothing about the chalice, nothing about any embezzlement. Embezzlement? Miss Marple's tone was mild, but her eyes were sharp. The constable colored slightly. "I shouldn't have mentioned that, miss. But seeing as you're a friend of the vicar's wife, and it's bound to come out anyway. We've been examining the church accounts. There are substantial irregularities going back nearly 2 years. Money from collections that never made it into the bank, charity funds that seem to have vanished. The inspector thinks it amounts to several £100s. And Mr. Greaves, as treasurer, would have been responsible for all financial records." "Yes, miss. We've been trying to locate him for questioning, but he seems to have made himself scarce. His landlady says he left his rooms yesterday evening with a suitcase and hasn't been back." So both Mrs. Langdon and Mr. Greaves had fled. That was most illuminating. Miss Marple's fingers resumed their knitting as her mind worked through the implications. "Has anyone thought to search the vestry thoroughly?" she asked. "The place where the accounts were kept." "The inspector went through it yesterday, miss. Found the account books all right and the ledgers. But there was something else he thought was odd. A locked metal box tucked behind the altar linens. We had to force it open as no one seemed to have the key. And what was inside?" "Letters, miss. A whole collection of them. Correspondence between the vicar and Mrs. Langdon. Nothing improper, mind you, just discussions about the parish finances. But they showed that both of them had known about the missing money for at least 6 weeks. They'd been investigating quietly, trying to gather proof before going to the authorities." "To avoid scandal," Miss Marple murmured. "That's what the inspector thinks." "But it puts them in rather an awkward position, doesn't it? Knowing about a crime and not reporting it. And then there's the matter of that child nearly dying." "You think there may be a connection?" "The inspector does, miss. He thinks Clara Hewitt may have overheard something she shouldn't have, or seen some document that implicated someone, and that person tried to silence her before she could speak." "Out." Miss Marple set down her knitting and looked directly at the young constable. "Tell me honestly, Constable Hendricks, does your inspector believe the vicar or Mrs. Langdon capable of poisoning a child?" The constable shifted uncomfortably. "He says he has to consider all possibilities, miss. They both had motive to keep Clara quiet. They both had access to the vestry where the poison was administered, and they both behaved suspiciously after the incident, whispering together, looking frightened." "Frightened and angry," Miss Marple said, half to herself. "Yes, that fits with what Clara told her mother. But, Constable, consider this. If you were going to poison someone to prevent them from speaking, would you do it in front of the entire village during a Christmas pageant? Wouldn't you choose a more private, less conspicuous moment?" The constable frowned. "I suppose that does seem rather odd when you put it that way." "It seems more than odd. It seems theatrical, almost deliberately public, as though someone wanted the poisoning to be discovered, wanted the scandal to come to light. But why would anyone want that?" "That," said Miss Marple, "is precisely what we must determine. Now, you mentioned that the metal box had to be forced open. Were there marks on it? Evidence of previous tampering?" "There were, miss, fresh scratches around the lock, as though someone had tried to pick it or pry it open with a tool," Miss Marple thought. Of the scratches on Mrs. Langdon's hand, the ones she had claimed came from the poor box. But suppose they had come from attempting to open the metal box instead? Suppose she had been trying to retrieve the incriminating letters before they could be found? "One more question, Constable. The cup that contained the poison, the one with the blue flowers, has it been examined thoroughly?" "It has, miss. The residue was definitely cyanide mixed into lemonade. But here's the curious thing. The inspector says the concentration was odd, either too much or too little. He couldn't quite determine, as though whoever prepared it wasn't entirely certain of the dosage, or as though they were not experienced in such matters. An amateur rather than someone with medical knowledge," Miss Marple suggested. "I hadn't thought of that." "Miss!" And yet Dr. Lawrence was conveniently present, a medical man from outside the parish, appearing at precisely the moment his expertise would be needed. "Don't you find that rather remarkable?" The constable's eyes widened. "You think Dr. Lawrence might be involved?" "I think," Miss Marple said carefully, "that very little in this affair has been coincidental. But I also think the answer lies not in who administered the poison, but in who the poison was meant for. Clara drank from that cup by accident. I'm convinced of it. The question is, whose cup was it originally?" The constable departed shortly thereafter, leaving Miss Marple alone with her thoughts and her knitting. Outside, the snow continued to fall over St. Oldhelm's Church, covering everything in pristine white, as though nature itself sought to draw a veil over the dark secrets that lay beneath. Chapter. 'Tis the letter in the hymn book. By afternoon, the snow had ceased, leaving St. Oldhelm's wrapped in an eerie quiet. Miss Marple, who had spent the morning in contemplation, announced to Mrs. Peaton that she wished to visit the church. "Are you quite sure, Jane?" her friend asked anxiously. "After what's happened there, I should think it would be the last place you'd want to go." "On the contrary," Miss Marple replied, buttoning her coat. "It is precisely the place I need to be. There are questions that can only be answered by examining the scene itself. The church was unlocked, though deserted." Miss Marple made her way slowly down the center aisle, her boots echoing on the stone floor. The nativity scene had been partially dismantled, the straw removed from the manger after the discovery of the chalice. The makeshift stage where Clara had stood still bore the splintered marks of the falling star. Miss Marple stood for a moment, visualizing the events of that fateful evening. The children in their costumes, the audience rapt with attention, the lights dimming, and then Clara stepping forward to deliver her lines, raising the cup to her lips before her entrance, as children will do when nervous and thirsty. But whose cup had it been originally? Miss Marple made her way to the vestry. The police had finished their examination, and the room bore the disheveled appearance of a place that had been thoroughly searched. Account books lay stacked on the table, pages marked with slips of paper. The metal box sat open, empty now of its incriminating correspondence. She examined the scratches on the lock that Constable Hendricks had mentioned. They were indeed recent, made by someone inexpert in the art of picking locks. Someone desperate, perhaps, to retrieve something before it could be found. Miss Marple moved to the alcove where the refreshments had been laid out on Christmas Eve. The cups had been removed, of course, but she could see the marks on the table where they had stood in their careful rows. Mrs. Langdon's particular arrangements, everything just so. She turned her attention to the vestry cupboards, opening them one by one. Inside were the usual items: spare candles, collection plates, boxes of hymn sheets. And then in the third cupboard, tucked behind a stack of old service books, she found something that made her pause. It was a small bottle, brown, glass with no label. Miss Marple picked it up carefully by its edges and held it to the light. Empty, but with a few drops of liquid still clinging to the interior. She sniffed cautiously and detected nothing, but that meant little. Many poisons were odorless. She wrapped the bottle in her handkerchief and placed it in her handbag. The police should examine it, though she suspected they had already conducted a thorough search. Unless, of course, someone had placed it there after the police had finished their work. Miss Marple returned to the nave and began a methodical examination of the pews, starting from the front. She was looking for something specific, though she could not have said exactly what. Some piece of evidence that had been overlooked in the chaos of Christmas Eve. She was in the 5th row when her diligent search was rewarded. Tucked into the hymn rack behind a well-worn copy of Ancient and Modern was a folded piece of paper. Miss Marple drew it out carefully and opened it. The handwriting was young, formed with care but betraying the author's limited education. It was Clara's hand. Miss Marple recognized it from having seen the child's name carefully printed on her script. The letter was brief, but devastating. Dear Vicar Peaton, I am writing to tell you something I saw that I think is wrong. After the service last Sunday, I stayed behind to help count the collection money like Mrs. Langdon asked me to. I saw Mr. Greaves take some of the envelopes and put them in his coat pocket instead of in the counting box. When I asked him about it, he said it was church business and I shouldn't worry. But then I saw you and Mrs. Langdon looking at papers with numbers on them, and you both looked so worried. I think Mr. Greaves has been stealing from the church. I wanted to tell you before Christmas, but I didn't want to spoil the nativity for everyone. After the play is over, I will come to see you and tell you everything I saw. I hope I am doing the right thing. Your friend, Clara Hewitt. Miss Marple read the letter twice, her mind racing. Here was the evidence she'd been seeking. Clara had witnessed Greaves's theft and had planned to expose him after the performance. But how had this letter ended up in a hymn book rather than in the vicar's hands? The answer, when it came to her, was both simple and terrible. Clara had intended to deliver the letter after the play, but someone had intercepted it. Someone who knew what it contained, and who could not allow it to be delivered. But who, and more importantly, how had they known about the letter's existence? Miss Marple sat down in the pew, her knitting forgotten, and forced herself to think through the sequence of events with ruthless logic. Clara writes the letter, intending to give it to the vicar after the performance. She perhaps shows it to someone, or mentions it, or leaves it somewhere it can be seen. That person realizes the danger and acts to prevent Clara from speaking. They poison her drink, knowing she will consume it before her big scene, but they make a mistake. They use too much or too little poison, as Constable Hendricks had mentioned, because they are not experienced in such matters. They are acting in panic, in desperation. And after the poisoning, they retrieve the letter from wherever Clara had left it and hide it in the church, meaning perhaps to destroy it later, but not daring to do so immediately while the police were investigating. The question was, who had known about the letter? Miss Marple thought back to her conversation with Mrs. Hewitt. The woman had said Clara was worried about something she'd seen, that she planned to tell the vicar after the performance. Had Clara confided in anyone else? Had she shown the letter to anyone before hiding it in the church? Miss Marple rose and made her way to the vestry once more. She examined the table where Mrs. Langdon had arranged the refreshments, the special cup with blue flowers designated for Clara as the Angel Gabriel. Anyone helping with the preparations would have known which cup was meant for the child. Mrs. Langdon had organized everything, but Mrs. Langdon had also been investigating Greaves's embezzlement with the vicar. Would she have poisoned Clara to protect Greaves? It seemed unlikely, unless Mrs. Langdon was protecting not Greaves, but someone else entirely. Or unless she had reasons of her own for wanting the investigation to stop. Miss Marple recalled the conversation she had overheard in the churchyard. Mrs. Langdon saying that Clara should never have found out. But found out what exactly? About Greaves's theft, or about something else? She thought about the scratches on Mrs. Langdon's hands, the forced lock on the metal box, the letters between her and the vicar. She thought about Mrs. Langdon's hasty departure from the village, claiming ill health, and she thought about Mr. Greaves, also fled, his whereabouts unknown. Two people running from something. But were they running from justice or from danger? Miss Marple tucked Clara's letter carefully into her handbag alongside the mysterious bottle. It was time, she decided, to share her findings with Constable Hendricks and his inspector. But first, she had one more call to make. She left the church and made her way through the snowy streets to the small cottage where Mr. Greaves had kept his rooms. His landlady, a sharp-eyed woman named Mrs. Potter, answered the door with obvious suspicion. If you're looking for Mr. Greaves, he's gone, and I don't know where. Left owing me 3 weeks' rent, the scoundrel. I'm not looking for him, Miss Marple assured her. But I wonder if I might ask you a question. Did Mr. Greaves receive any visitors in the days before Christmas? Mrs. Potter's expression softened slightly at Miss Marple's gentle manner. Now you mention it, yes. A lady came to see him on the evening before Christmas Eve. Quite agitated she was. I heard raised voices from his rooms. Can you describe this lady? Tall, thin, always wore her hat at an angle. Mrs. Langdon, the choir mistress. Miss Marple thanked Mrs. Potter and walked slowly back toward the vicarage, her mind working through this new information. Mrs. Langdon had visited Greaves privately, and they had argued. The next day, the poisoning occurred, and now both had fled the village. The pattern was becoming clearer, though one crucial piece remained missing. She needed to know who had been the intended victim of that poisoned cup. Chapter 10. The Silence Broken. The inquest was held 3 days later in the parish hall, a cramped affair attended by what seemed to be the entire population of St. Oldhelms. Miss Marple sat in the second row, her knitting bag on her lap, observing the proceedings. With her usual quiet attention, the coroner, a dry-voiced man from the county offices, conducted the examination with methodical precision. Dr. Morrison testified to Clara's condition, confirming that she had been poisoned with cyanide, but was expected, mercifully, to recover, though her speech remained impaired. Dr. Lawrence, the visiting physician, corroborated this testimony. Constable Hendricks presented the physical evidence: the cup with its residue of poison, the bottle Miss Marple had discovered in the vestry cupboard, Clara's letter found in the hymn book. Each item was examined and entered into the record. Mrs. Hewitt gave her testimony through tears, describing her daughter's anxiety in the days before Christmas and her intention to speak with the vicar after the performance. The vicar himself appeared pale and drawn, his voice barely audible, as he admitted to knowing about the financial irregularities for several weeks. He had been trying, he said, to gather sufficient evidence before bringing the matter to the authorities. He had not wished to destroy a man's reputation without proof. "And Mrs. Langdon?" the coroner inquired. "She was assisting you in this investigation?" "She was. Edith, Mrs. Langdon, had a talent for accounts. She discovered the discrepancies first and brought them to my attention. Yet she has now left the village rather suddenly." "For her health?" the vicar said, but his tone lacked conviction. It was at this moment that Miss Marple rose to her feet. "If I might be permitted to address the inquest," she said in her gentle voice, "I believe I can shed some light on these tragic events." The coroner looked startled, but after a moment's hesitation, nodded his assent. Miss Marple moved to the front of the room, her manner calm and assured, despite the dozens of eyes fixed upon her. "I have spent these past days," she began, "attempting to understand what occurred on Christmas Eve. The facts as presented suggest that young Clara Hewitt was deliberately poisoned to prevent her from revealing Mr. Greaves's theft of church funds. This is a logical conclusion, but I believe it to be incorrect." A murmur ran through the assembled crowd. The vicar leaned forward, his expression intent. "Clara was not the intended victim," Miss Marple continued. "She drank from a cup meant for someone else entirely. The cup with the blue flowers, specially designated for her role as the angel Gabriel, should have remained untouched until the interval. But Clara, nervous and thirsty, drank from it early, an accident, but one that revealed the true target of the poisoning." "And who was that target?" the coroner asked. "Mrs. Edith Langdon." The room erupted in shocked whispers. Mrs. Peaton gasped audibly. Missy Marple waited for silence before continuing. "Mrs. Langdon had been investigating the church accounts with the vicar's assistance. She had discovered not only that Mr. Greaves was embezzling funds, but something far more damaging to certain parties. She had found evidence that the Christmas charity money, intended for the poor of the parish, had been systematically diverted for personal use. But the thief was not Mr. Greaves alone." She paused, her eyes moving across the room until they settled on a figure at the back. Major Hartley, the church warden, sat very still, his face frozen. "Mrs. Langdon visited Mr. Greaves on the evening before Christmas Eve," Miss Marple said. His landlady heard them arguing. I believe Mrs. Langdon confronted him with her evidence and demanded that he confess. But Mr. Greaves revealed something that shocked her. He had not been acting alone. He had been coerced into falsifying the accounts by someone in a position of authority over the church finances, someone who stood to benefit from the theft and who had been pressuring him for months. This is outrageous speculation, Major Hartley said, his voice too loud in the quiet room, but he did not rise from his seat. Is it? Miss Marple's tone remained mild. Mr. Greaves was a weak man, a man with debts and a drinking problem, an easy target for someone stronger, someone who could threaten him with exposure while promising protection. You were in the vestry on Christmas Eve, Major Hartley. You had access to the refreshments, and you knew that. Mrs. Langdon would drink from the special cup, as she always did during performances to calm her nerves before playing the piano. You have no proof of this. I have Clara's letter, which documents what she witnessed. I have the bottle I found hidden in the vestry, which will bear fingerprints. And I have the testimony of Mrs. Langdon herself, who has not fled to Bath, but to the county police, where she has been giving evidence against you for the past 2 days. The silence that followed was absolute. Then, Major Hartley stood abruptly, his face mottled with rage. She was going to destroy everything. Years of careful management, of using those funds for proper purposes, for improvements the parish actually needed. The vicar was too weak to make hard decisions, so someone had to. And when that meddling woman started prying into matters that didn't concern her, threatening to expose everything, he stopped, seeming to realize what he had admitted. Constable Hendricks moved toward him, and the major's shoulders sagged in defeat. I never meant to harm a child, he said quietly. When I heard what had happened, when I realized Clara had drunk the poison instead, I've not slept since. As the constable led Major Hartley away, Miss Marple returned to her seat. The vicar sat with his head in his hands, and Mrs. Peaton wept silently. The inquest concluded swiftly after that. The coroner recorded a verdict of attempted murder, with Clara Hewitt as an accidental victim. The church was to undergo a full audit, and a new treasurer would be appointed. As Miss Marple prepared to leave St. Aldhelms the following morning, Mrs. Peaton embraced her tearfully. "How did you know?" she asked. "How did you see what no one else could?" Miss Marple smiled gently. "Because even in a nativity, there is always someone who forgets the light and chooses instead to hide in shadow. The major believed his theft was justified, that the ends excused the means. But darkness, once embraced, leads only to darker deeds." The church bells of St. Aldhelms remained silent that morning as Miss Marple's train pulled away from the station. But in the hospital, Clara Hewitt opened her eyes and spoke her first words since Christmas Eve. The silence, at last, was broken.